welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and today I have with me one of the world's best-known historians of religion, Professor Ronald Hutton of Bristol University. Professor Hutton, welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, today we're going to be talking about a number of things, including a book which you have coming out this year. I think a good place to start is the issue of pagan survivals in Christian cultures. By way of background, there's a long tradition, I think it goes back at least to the Reformation, of scholars thinking that they've found survivals of ancient paganism in Christian cultures. In the 19th and the 20th centuries, in particular, you had anthropologists, scholars of folklore, claiming that popular folk customs and festivals and so on were survivals of ancient pre-Christian pagan rites. The most extreme claim of this kind came from Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wicca, who claimed to have discovered an entire surviving pagan witch religion in 1950s England. Professor Hutton, much of your previous research has focused on this issue of pagan survivals, hasn't it?
It has indeed, although most of the time when I'm talking about this particular subject, I'm recounting and drawing attention to the research of others, which has taken place before mine, rather than actually introducing new research of my own.
I think the best-known publication that you've released on this is The Triumph of the Moon, which originally came out in the 90s and went into a second edition in 2019. The premise of that was that the things that have been identified as pagan survivals aren't actually pagan survivals, but they nevertheless have an interesting and colourful history of their own. Would it be fair to sum that up in that way?
Yes, it would be perfectly fair. I wrote that book not to debunk the foundation myths of modern paganism, or to try to persuade modern pagans that their traditional history was incorrect. I wrote it because that traditional history had already collapsed among British pagans by 1990, by whom I mean the leaders of the established pagan organizations and traditions in Britain, whom I knew very well. And what had been left was a vacuum. And my book set out to fill that vacuum. That's why the book doesn't actually spend very much time debunking the traditional picture and showing exactly why it's wrong, because that had already happened. What I do instead is try to show how modern paganism did arise, and in doing so, how it drew upon what were very often quite mainstream and very important cultural currents in modern British society that also connected with others in lands across the seas to which British-style paganism spread. So it wasn't an iconoclastic or a debunking book, it was a reconstruction.
Although, of course, as is often the case with these matters, there were people who were adherents of modern pagan traditions who saw this as being problematic for their own identity.
Yes, and what was more, as it were, unreal for me is that these people tended to live in different hemispheres of the world, totally different cultural contexts. Very many of them tended to be quite recent converts to paganism and to have been converted by people in their own lands who still adhered to the traditional foundation stories. And so a book of mine that was supposed to fill a vacuum and build up a proper history to replace one that had collapsed was taken by them as a direct and deliberate attack on their religion. And because of the totally different context, the disconnect between us, there wasn't a lot I could do about that.
Indeed. And turning to academic research, I think it's fair to say that the debate about pagan survivals has been framed in a particular way. Christianity is assumed to be a pretty straightforward religious system. It's monotheistic, it's centered on Jesus. So if you find a belief or a practice which looks a bit odd in a Christian society, there's a temptation to say, well, it must be a survival of paganism.
That is true. It's really a particular strain of thought within Christianity, which has been associated with exceptionally austere evangelical reforming churchmen through the Middle Ages, and later on with people trying very hard to draw the demarcations, the limits of Christianity. It's really a Protestant approach to Christianity, or a reforming Catholic one, a Catholic counter-Reformation one. And it's usually had to reckon with usually a vast bulk of ordinary Christians who see no problems whatsoever in an eclectic approach to Christianity. But then evangelical, austere, reforming churchmen and their later descendants tend to be highly literate, and it tends to be their texts that survive in the historical record. So what is in many ways a rather unrepresentative and minority viewpoint is hugely overrepresented in the historical sources.
And it's taken on, subconsciously at least, by modern secular historians.
Yes, it very much is. The idea that there was an enormous survival of paganism in the Christian centuries, both as elements within Christian culture and as a kind of pagan underground or resistance movement or dual religion, really burgeoned in the 19th century. It had been a Protestant trope since the Reformation that Catholicism was Christianity contaminated by paganism, from which the Reformation had attempted, with success, most Protestants would say, to purge it. But in the 19th century, two more emotional resources tapped in to reinforce this wish to see pagan survivals everywhere. One was simply a desire to debunk Christianity, the beginning of the secularization of British society in particular, which loved debunking the idea of the Christian Middle Ages as a great age of faith by suggesting that pretty well everybody in them was pagan anyway. And the other very different emotional impulse was reaction against the wholesale urbanization and industrialization of 19th century Britain, particularly England, which yearned for a preservation of the shrinking English countryside and a tendency to see the countryside as a pristine alien world of organic continuity, in which every parish church had been built on a pagan temple, and there were no violent disruptions of anything. So you could feel safe and secure and still connected to an organic, fertile, rather loving past. And these two massive reinforcements produced a tremendous quest by scholars in the late Victorian period and the early 20th century to find pagan survivals in Christian Britain.
Yes, as to that last point, it's quite a romantic, nationalistic current of thought, isn't it?
It is, and it fed directly into and was nurtured by a romantic nationalism. It's a very exciting, it's a very comforting way of looking at Britishness and especially at Englishness. And it's entirely natural that people should have felt like that. It's also entirely natural that scholars should have begun to abandon it as those Victorian impulses lessened in late 20th century Britain.
Okay. As you've said, there's a strong Protestant element in all this. So, for example, Protestant polemicists would look at Catholicism and they'd say, well, you have the Virgin Mary and the angels and the saints, and they look like polytheistic deities. And they'd say that Catholics practice unbiblical rituals, and they'd say that these things can't be Christian, so they must be something else. They must be a legacy of the pagan past. But I understand that your forthcoming book frames the subject in a different way, so as to get away from the idea that something in a Christian society that looks a bit odd to Protestant eyes must be pagan. Because Christian societies were perfectly capable of developing divine figures and symbols and not simply retaining them from the pagan past.
I think that sums it up extremely well. I've actually presented two different models which are complementary as alternatives to the Protestant polemic to which you've referred. One of them is to suggest that what medieval Christianity did was establish parallel services to pagan tradition. In other words, there are actually very few cases in Europe of pagan deities being transformed straight into Christian saints. But Christian saints, while attached to a completely different theology, did fulfill most of the practical and emotional functions of polytheistic pagan deities in pagan society. And there are a number of different parallels of this sort found between Christianity and paganism. Not so much a direct takeover as a Christian recreation of the same services and the same ideas in a different form. But you're right that my latest book fills out a different area of space. That what I'm arguing is that there are plenty of phenomena at all levels of medieval and early modern European society which simply don't fit neatly into the categories of either being Christian or of being survivals from ancient paganism. In other words, they're figures and ideas that look thoroughly un-Christian. They look thoroughly pagan, but they seem to have developed in, arisen in, been encountered in or imagined in the Christian centuries themselves. And so in many ways, I find the old polarized Christian pagan terminology rather unhelpful when discussing this kind of phenomenon.
Okay. Let's turn now to your forthcoming book and have a closer look at it. The title of the book is Queens of the Wild.
It is, which was chosen by my publisher. I by no means disown it. As often happens, the biggest tussles between myself and my publishers, and I have very, very, very good publishers at present in Yale University Press, didn't take place over any of the content of the book, but over the title and the cover picture. And in the end, Yale presented me with a dozen different titles that it wanted to be eye-catching to the public, having rejected all of my own proposals. And in the end, I selected the one which I disliked least. I think it's a great, colourful, eye-catching title. The subtitle is Pagan Goddesses in Christian Europe, an Investigation. I quail a bit at that because I'm actually suggesting that they may look like goddesses, but they're not easily called goddess figures. But Yale wanted goddesses in there in order to sell more books. And I see their point. So after rejecting about 11 alternatives, I accepted that as the one that approximated most to what was actually inside the book.
If you'd had a totally free hand, what title would you have chosen?
The title I proposed originally, and any sane person in retrospect can see why Yale didn't want it, was Christian Goddesses, ? The issue of pagan survivals reconsidered, because these were goddess-like figures in Christian Europe. So they weren't goddesses, they weren't worshipped as goddesses, but they had much the same kind of personae, and they fulfilled a lot of the same emotional functions.
So that question mark would have been essential.
It would have been absolutely essential. But Yale quite rightly felt that it was a title that would confuse the casual reader. And since, to Yale's glee, I've been relatively good at picking up casual readers in previous books, Yale wasn't about to ruin a winning streak.
Oh, well, fair enough.
Yeah.
And as to the divine figures that you consider in the book, there are 4 of those, aren't there?
Yes, and they're found at different levels of society. One of them is really an intellectual construct, and the other three are genuinely popular. They're genuinely revered by or believed in by ordinary people, even if the ordinary people often regard them as figures in which other people believe rather than they themselves. There are still plenty in the record who had personal encounters with them and recounted these.
The intellectual figure is Mother Earth, is that right?
Yes, Mother Earth or Mother Nature. The idea of a single great goddess who cares for and represents the terrestrial world, often with a connection to the night sky, and to people who are nominally Christians, and sometimes fervent Christians, acted as a kind of intermediary to the Christian God in caring for the world.
It might be tempting to say that if there's a divine figure who represents the earth or nature, that figure must come from ancient paganism. The Romans had a goddess of the earth, the Greeks had Gaia, the earth goddess, but it seems that you're saying that that wasn't the case.
There are ancient roots in this case, the distinction being that Mother Earth, Mother Nature, Natura to the Romans, Gaia to the Greeks, wasn't actually worshipped, didn't have a cult. In other words, there's not a single temple to Natura or Gaia. Gaia was occasionally given a statue, very rarely, in the temples dedicated to other deities. But the great role of Gaia and Natura are as symbolic figures in literature. And one of the reasons why medieval Christians felt that it was much easier to take these figures over and then develop them considerably is because there wasn't a pagan cult of them. So they hadn't been tarnished by that. And that's why these were much more readily assimilated to a Christian cosmology. But they were given an importance in that cosmology which they'd never possessed in the pagan ancient world, and became really quite major figures to a lot of philosophers and poets and mystics.
And was there an attempt to integrate the figure of Mother Nature or Mother Earth into a Christian cosmology?
Oh, very much so. And it takes place from around about the 6th or 7th century, right through to the late 19th, in a particular form, which is, yes, God and the Trinity are the bosses of the universe, and they look after things like salvation and the next world. But the physical world, including heavenly bodies, are entrusted to this benevolent female entity who takes her orders from God or is instructed by God and then let loose, but actually cares for the natural world from day to day.
Okay. Another female divinity who you consider in the book is the furry queen. Yes,
that's right. The idea of a superhuman female who lives within the terrestrial world can have a semi-divine consort, the fairy king or the elven king. And she appears in the 14th century. She isn't present before then. And she appears very much in elite literature and Romance literature, crystallizing out of an earlier, a prehistoric belief in elves, in these fairy-like beings in the natural world, but drawing on images of the ancient pagan deities Pluto and Proserpine, or Persephone, or Hades and Persephone. And above all, given a tremendous imaginative boost by the high medieval, that's 12th, 13th century troubadour Romance tradition of gorgeous entities called fays. They first appear in French, and they are really semi-divine alternatives to aristocratic human beings with their own courts and their own castles and their own sumptuous lifestyle, who interact with and interfere with human beings. They don't have monarchs, but monarchs appear in the 14th century, and they really get into popular culture in every part of Britain by the 15th. And they're a massive part of Welsh, Scottish and English popular culture right through the early modern period.
And in this case, there are links with ancient pagan culture.
Yes, that's right. But the links into ancient pagan culture come through high literature. It's Hades and Persephone, or it's Pluto and Proserpine, usually the latter from the Roman texts, brought in by people who've had a Latin education. This isn't a popular tradition of fairy monarchs or elven monarchs surviving from the Anglo-Saxons or the ancient Celts.
I suppose the most famous expression of the fairy queen would be in Edmund Spenser.
Yes, this is famous for two reasons. The first is there's just so much of it. It's an enormous book, although a very late, self-conscious harking back to medieval romance tradition. And the other reason is that Spenser's idiosyncratic spelling of fairy with an E in it was taken up by the 19th century English romantics, and it's the preferred spelling for modern writers about fairy lore and the fairy realm, largely because of the romantic poets' adoption of it.
Okay. Moving on to the next of the figures who you consider. This is the figure who you call the Lady of the Night.
Yes, it's quite hard to find an all-embracing name for her. She's the figure who is a superhuman female who leads a retinue of spirits and favored human beings through the night, sometimes across the sky, sometimes across the earth, sometimes feasting and reveling in wild places, sometimes visiting and blessing the homes of favored human beings. Churchmen called her Diana or Herodias, terms taken from the New Testament. The ordinary people gave her an abundance of local names, all relating to generosity, opulence, provision of goodies, names like Satia, Abundia, Habondia, Percht, Holla or Holder or Hulda or Hulda, depending on the linguistic zone you're in.
And this, I believe, is the figure who's known as Aradia.
Yes, Aradia is just the Italian version of Herodias, the name from the Bible.
And the figure of Aradia is of some significance to modern revived paganism.
Yes, for good reason. She is, as I say, the Italian version of Herodias. And at the end of the 1890s, an American folklorist called Charles Godfrey Leland, who lived for a considerable time in Italy and collected a lot of folklore there, claimed to have been given the gospel, as he called it, of a surviving pagan witch religion, centered on Aradia, Herodias, the daughter of Diana and of Lucifer, the morning star. And what this actually is a vision of the Lady of the Night tradition, which was current in 16th century Italy and features in the witch trials there. And it may have sunk into genuine Italian folklore and reached Leland through that, or it may have been created by 19th century Italians from the 16th century texts. So far, historians and folklorists have failed to find any trace of an actual surviving pagan witch cult of this sort in 19th century Italy. They haven't found it in 16th century Italy either. It's very much a 16th century Italian intellectual construct by witch hunters, ironically. But there's a great deal of genuine Italian folklore, charms and spells found in Leland's texts.
So we can say that the figure of Aradia, although she tends to be seen as a pagan figure and she has anti-Christian associations, we can say that she's a figure who emerged from Christian society.
Yeah, she arose within Christian society. I say this because she's first recorded in what's probably the Rhineland in the 9th century. And then slowly over the next few hundred years, the idea of her spreads outwards to east and to west to cover a huge area of Europe, from northern Spain right through France and the Netherlands to the far ends of Germany and to Italy and Sicily. And then she contracts again in the 16th, 17th centuries and her tradition breaks into some extremely well demarcated and particular local forms which survive into modern times. She clearly fulfills a very powerful emotional need for a great many medieval and early modern people who otherwise have the appearance of being regular Christians.
So Aradia actually survives into modern times.
Yes, although she tends not outside Leland's area to be called Aradia. She has names like Befana or Sibylla. There are plenty of local names. Holler is still known very well in northern central German folklore. Frau Percht in Bavaria and the Austrian lands. So the local names that she'd acquired by the late Middle Ages are still very well established. I looked for actual known pagan goddesses who were equivalent to her and just couldn't find any. There are elements in lots of different pagan goddesses that look similar to elements in her tradition, but they're rearranged in a different form in the Christian centuries. And as I say, it's not just a matter of surviving, it spreads, it burgeons, it colonizes a large area of Europe and is extremely popular there.
Okay. To move on to the fourth of the figures in the book, I believe this is the old woman of Celtic mythology.
Specifically Gaelic, yes. Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the Scottish Highlands and Islands. The Cailleach or Cailleach or Cailleach. The name means the veiled one. And originally it's an early medieval Irish name for a nun. And the fount of the tradition seems to be in a very influential, a very well-known early medieval Irish poem about a beautiful royal woman who's been abandoned by wealth and by lovers in her old age and found her consolation in religion. So it's a classic Christian trope of the vanity of worldly affairs and worldly rewards and the permanence of heaven. But this figure with her name as the Cailleach Bar or Bara is the foundation for what becomes an extremely widespread popular figure found throughout the Gaelic world. I think that she absorbs much older traditions of powerful elderly female figures associated with the natural landscape and bonds them together in a common figure. And then in a twist that doesn't happen to the others, in the 20th century, some folklorists turn her into a pagan goddess, a surviving pagan goddess, and give her a unity and an identity which the original stories didn't quite have.
Yes. The role of 20th century and 19th century folklorists is often quite creative, isn't it?
It's very creative, and I look benevolently upon it for three reasons. The first is it gave modern culture some extremely user-friendly images and ideas very much suited to it, which have worked wonders for artists, poets, novelists, and for people's own spirituality. I think that's entirely legitimate. The second reason for my lack of animosity towards it is that these people were pioneers. They collected masses of valuable data for later scholarship and had a lot of really good and enduring original ideas. The fact that they may have put together bits of jigsaw that didn't actually fit and created new pictures out of them is just a completely inevitable and necessary side effect of what was generally a very sound and very firm basis for later work. And the third reason why I can be benevolent is that it outlived its use. So much Victorian and Edwardian scholarship got ruthlessly re-examined in the 70s and 80s as part of the the European, largely British, I think also in many cases American rejection of 19th and early 20th century morals, political ideas, and assumptions about the nature of humanity and the world.
Okay. Your book's something of a first step in a new direction, isn't it? What would you say to anyone listening who's doing research or thinking of doing research in this area?
I think that if we can get away from the imprisonment, the 19th century imprisonment of terminology into this idea of pagan versus Christian, or pagan and Christian being the alternatives, and to see the cultures that were dominated formerly by Christianity as being intensely complex and dynamic at all levels of society, and constantly evolving in their idea of the divine and the supernatural, and giving us an enormous amount of really complex and very live material with which to work imaginatively, by which to be inspired, then that is, I think, a spur to scholarship, as well as the creative arts and literatures. As I've suggested, looked at from this angle, there's so much new stuff out there. We've hardly really begun with the job. I don't really see myself as a pioneer. I see myself as part of the continuity. One of the reasons why I have a sense of kinship with the Victorian scholars whose work was dismantled by my immediate predecessors, and in the ruins of which I'm working with the task of rebuilding, is to me their family. They are my own predecessors. I work in their institutions. I deliver addresses from the same podia physically which they occupied. I see them as my own illustrious ancestors.
Yeah. I think it's a positive development that we're moving away from the old debate on pagan survivals, because that debate was essentially based on an idea of a pure Christianity and also a pure paganism. It's ideas of purity. And there was the idea that if you find things in Christian cultures that look a bit odd, then they must be foreign, they must be alien, they must have come from somewhere else.
That puts it very well, probably a lot better than I could put it myself.
Yeah, and this feeds, I think, into a wider issue, because this is one of these areas where scholarship makes contact with broader currents in society, and broader political and religious battles. And those battles are often about purity. We've talked about the very evangelical form of Christianity, which seeks to hunt down things that are deemed to be pagan. There's also a fringe minority in modern paganism which shades into nationalism and racism. Would you agree that historians have a role to play in essentially complicating these ideas of purity and complicating simplistic ideas of what belongs to one group and what belongs to another?
I think very much so. There's also a radical minority of pagans, I can fit into your summary there, who are profoundly anti-Christian and see themselves as locked into a battle between good and evil, with a cosmic polarity that would do credit to any Christian bigot. But scholars are constantly embroiled in current issues. I've never, ever felt myself to have the comfort or luxury of living in an ivory tower, quite apart from the mixed reactions that my own work has had among very different groups of pagans in different parts of the world. And it's tended to take the form very often as a football between opposed groups of pagans in particular areas. I also had to contend with a great deal of unpleasantness from people in mainstream society when they realized that I was daring to write the history of modern paganism. There's a very strong feeling that this was a subject that a respectable scholar shouldn't touch. And I think I lost about 10 years of my career because I wrote that book, Triumph of the Moon. I had to put up with a lot of personal unpleasantness. But the effects overall can be considerable. I'll give you just two examples. One is that I wrote a book called The Witch, which was published in 2017. And as part of that, I drew attention to the increase of witch hunting in many parts of the present world and called for a worldwide effort against it. And this resonated with a network of scholars and human rights campaigners that was engaged in that work. And there was a conference held at Lancaster University as a result a couple of years ago, at which I gave one of the keynote addresses and a representative from the United Nations gave another. And the purpose of the conference was to unite an international network of people to draft a resolution for the United Nations outlawing witch hunting, or to be precise and legal, outlawing acts of violence or persecution against human beings based on beliefs concerning magic. And that was adopted by the United Nations Council for Human Rights in July. So that is the beginning of a worldwide effort based partly on academic research. On the microcosm of this, in an English provincial town last winter, a modern druid was driving to a meeting, to a ritual, and he had his druid robes and ceremonial sword on the back seat of the car. He had just started some completely unfamiliar medication, and it hit him with a reaction he hadn't expected. And at the wrong moment, he drove rather erratically, and there was a police car parked on the watch, and he saw him do this, pulled him over. And then the police saw his sword on the back seat and arrested him and charged him with possession of an offensive weapon. Now, this happens occasionally. And when he was called to trial, and a custodial sentence is the maximum penalty for that offence, his solicitor wrote to me as an academic expert on modern druids and asked me if I'd provide a testimonial as an informed academic that druids do carry ceremonial swords bona fide as part of their religion. And I cheerfully did this. And at the beginning of the trial, the judge read this testimonial and threw out the case against the druid. This is something I've done repeatedly in the legal system over the last quarter of a century as part of the service. But it does go to show that on the macrocosm of a global setting and the microcosm of an individual one, academic research is making a difference. I would like to think helping and defending people all the time.
Well, that seems like a very good note on which to end. Professor Ronald Hutton, that's been very interesting. Thank you very much for being with us.
It's been a huge pleasure.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.